All right, what is up? So today, finally going to get to the transparency of evil. Now, before I get into this, I want to share a funny little story. I don't know if I've shared it before, but I was first made aware of this at Baudrillard conference in Oxford in the September, and Richard Smith shared this funny story about Baudrillard, where after he died, this man who lived down the road from Baudrillard went to Baudrillard's late widow, I guess, and said, "Hey, I have all these photos of Baudrillard," which is extremely creepy. But this guy would see who he didn't know to be Baudrillard, or didn't know what Baudrillard did in his life, but would see this old man every day walk down the road, perhaps not every day, but some days, walk down the road and throw his mail in the garbage. And so this guy was fascinated with this old man that would do that and would take photos of him. And I just thought it's a funny story that Baudrillard would just throw out his mail every day. But with that, that being said, to jump into the transparency of evil, this is a pretty pertinent text in Baudrillard's work. Obviously, for many of you, I'm sure, know that. It's one of his texts that are actually taken up, I think, in university classes, in whatever department, English departments, maybe sociology, but I somehow doubt it. It's one of his works that are taken the most seriously, and it's one of those that it's fairly accessible. And I say that to mean two different things. Reading it without understanding the rest of Baudrillard's work can still allow someone to understand what is going on. So while it's still difficult, someone can read it and still get something out of it. I think that someone who is more versed in Baudrillard's work, especially how it develops across time, would have a very different kind of understanding of it. So for that reason, before I kind of jump into it, I want to reiterate one or two ideas from some previous texts. Firstly, from The Perfect Crime, when Baudrillard makes a distinction between what he calls a conflictual reality and a non-contradictory reality. So this is a very important distinction, because for Baudrillard, simulation nor reality are things that are in and of themselves problematic. It's only when they take on a certain character that they become problematic or they become oppressive. So for Baudrillard, he makes the distinction as being one between a conflicting reality, in the case of reality, or a non-contradictory reality. So a conflicting reality allows for problems. It allows for negativity. It allows for, that sort of encapsulates it. Whereas a non-contradictory reality is a kind of perfectly kind of whitewashed, end to all evil, kind of setting up what this book is about here, kind of end to all evil, end to all things bad, right? Which is, for Baudrillard, probably the thing that worries him the most. So again, or not again, but we could think of one of his passages from Fatal Strategies when he says that he fears not terrorism nearly as much as he fears a state capable of eradicating it. So these are some kind of important ideas, and of course, jumping into this book without understanding the three degrees of simulation, it would be incredibly difficult, because he proposes a fourth. So this is the first time that he gives us this idea of the fourth stage of the simulacrum, in 91, right? So he'd been writing now for 27 years, I guess. Well, longer than that, but since his first book. So he begins this book talking about the orgy, right? So what comes after the orgy? So he says the orgy in question was the moment when modernity exploded upon us, the moment of liberation in every sphere. So that's one of the things that, he is kind of alluded to throughout all his work, his fear of having things become kind of hyper-present, right? So we think of Baudrillard and we think of the hyper-real. I think we can also think of that as being the hyper-present, where everything is made immediately available to us all our desires have been realized, and we kind of live in a Huxleyan, kind of brave new world situation where there is no, I guess, seduction. There is no more desire in a the way that Baudrillard conceives of it. So seduction, for those that don't know, is that which opposes, for Baudrillard, it opposes seduction. It opposes production. Seduction is that which maintains a certain degree of illusion and a certain degree of the unknown, or I guess the kind of mystery of the world. That is because seduction, and etymologically we can understand it as, from the old French, as to divert from one's path. It wrests people from their respective positions and throws them, it kind of casts them into the unknown, where they can then become something else or change or anything like that. So there's a distinction to be drawn here between how Baudrillard kind of conceives of seduction, and thinkers like Deleuze and Guattari imagine desire or desiring machines, where when Deleuze and Guattari in A Thousand Plateaus kind of lay out a call to arms for the reader, saying like, deterritorialize yourself, remove your face, kind of things. Baudrillard says that no one can actually seduce or take on seduction as though it was a force to be mobilized. Seduction is something that kind of happens to you. You can't just take it on, because for him, that would just be another mode of production. That would just be another realization of a kind of moment of modernity in this kind of hyper-individualistic, world mindset that we've kind of globalized mindset that we've taken on. So the orgy is then the end of seduction. The orgy, at least for now, we can understand it as being the realization of all things, removing the possibility of illusion or mystery from entering the world. So so many people read Baudrillard in so many different ways, but they're always kind of on the periphery. There's always hope in Baudrillard. There are always kind of, he kind of undercuts his own kind of cautionary tales by saying something like, seduction can never be destroyed, or seduction never goes away. The illusion will always be there. Mystery will always be there in some form or other. So, so many people would come out who are very quick in saying Baudrillard is like a nihilist or pessimist, or there's no hope, and all we can do is essentially accept the system we're in, or anything like that. Where personally, I see nothing of the sort. In fact, Baudrillard is a rather optimistic thinker, because as he says when he speaks about the orgy, that there's that woman that says, whispers in the man's ear, what are you doing after the orgy? So he says there is retained in that moment, even in the most kind of hyper-real experience, in the case of the orgy here, there is still kind of the glimmerings of seduction, of how it has maintained itself in some form, allowing for a kind of, imaginative possibility, or unimaginative, in that it cannot be really conceived. Now, with that being said, he obviously has some rather pessimistic outlooks, and please, I don't want it to be a clear-cut, he's an optimist or he's a nihilist or anything like that. I think that he certainly oscillates between the two, and for me, I just tend to be more of an optimistic reader. So we get the glimmer, or we get kind of a sense of his pessimism here when he says, we may pretend to carry on in the same direction, accelerating, but in reality, we are accelerating in a void, because all the goals of liberation are already behind us. So when he's speaking about liberation, he's speaking about it in terms of sexual liberation, in the sexual liberation, the liberation of the working class, liberation of, identity or anything like that. He says we are ultimately free to be whoever we want. But of course, this is a kind of freedom that is mediated by, multinational corporations, or by our confinement to a sort of internet, media sphere or anything like that we have to take into account, right? So it's kind of the McLuhanian medium is the message type thing. So what then, or how do we figure in this new stage of simulation? Well, he gives us a kind of long definition of it, or a kind of long mapping of it. So he says, let me introduce a new particle into the microphysics of simulacra. That language is really interesting, and we'll talk about it more later. For after the natural, commodity, and structural stages of value comes the fractal stage. The first of three of these stages had a natural referent, and value developed on the basis of a natural use of the world. The second was founded on a general equivalence, and value developed by reference to a logic of the commodity. The third is governed by a code, and value develops here by reference to a set of models. At the fourth, the fractal, or viral, or radiant stage of value, there is no point of reference at all, and value radiates in all directions, occupying all interstices without reference to anything whatsoever, by virtue of pure contiguity, or contiguity. Okay, so this demands a whole lot of clarification, and I obviously can't get into it all because it would demand going back to symbolic exchange and death and simulacra and simulation. So for those that or perhaps it's jumping into this text because you have to, or this video here, and you have to read it for class or something like that, you might find yourself a little confused, and what would help is to go to specifically, if you want to go through it through my stuff here, or if you want to look it up online, the books you want to look at are Symbolic Exchange and Death and Simulacra and Simulation. Or there's another little book titled Simulations that compiles the one chapter from Symbolic Exchange and Death and the one chapter from Simulacra and Simulation that both talk about the three stages of the simulacrum. So that's a kind of quick way to get into that. But what I will say here, and what is exceptionally important, is that when Baudrillard says that the first three stages were occupied with a kind of natural referent, we have to be very careful as to not believe that Baudrillard is advocating for a kind of transcendent reality that is simply obfuscated, that's kind of obscured by simulation. Everything is always already simulation for Baudrillard, and this is how he's, certainly Kantian in this sense, where because everything is mediated by our perceptions of it, everything is mediated by the world as perception, we can never actually get to a kind of thing in itself, right? Nothing has a kind of transcendent, real value. It is always mediated to some extent by our, biological limitations. That is, how we don't actually see the thing in the world, we see our brain's perception of the thing in the world. So when he refers to a natural referent, it is still a simulated natural referent. Simulation is always already present. So when he speaks about it in terms of the fourth stage, where there is no longer an attachment to this natural reference, I want to bring us back to how I started this video, speaking about his distinction between non-contradictory and conflictual reality, where I believe we can say the same thing about simulation, where this kind of natural simulation is one that he applauds, but it is not one that, is not without its own faults. Whereas now we see a simulation that is perfect. It has absolutely no attachment to a possibility of confliction, to the possibility of evil, to the possibility of negativity, to anything like that. Rather, what we are seeing is the transparency of evil, where evil is, made wholly apparent. It can then be consumed and, can be made a part of everything else, where there's a kind of homogenization of the world to some extent. That is the simulation he's referring to here, the one developing in the fourth stage, one that is not necessarily a breach or a move away from reality, but is of course the more real than real, right? Or the more real, then the more real, then the more real, then the more real. So we then, as humans, come to resemble what he calls integrated circuits, right? Where there's a kind of machinic enslavement to the kind of computer network, where we could think of the relationship between the internet and globalization, how these two things certainly work hand in hand. We could see the human kind of disappearing into those flows, into those networks, and are then able to kind of exist everywhere at every time. So there's that degree of transparency. And this is certainly apparent when it comes to various kind of paranoid infused internet personalities who say that, we're being watched by the government or anything like that. For Baudrillard, I think quite simply, he would say, you already give up all of your information willingly on various social media. Like, there's absolutely no need for people to be wiretapping you or kind of getting into your personal conversations or anything like that. You already give yourself up to the public sphere. Everything is public at this point. There is no possibility of escaping it, because we subscribe to these kind of dominant codes which are governed by transparency, right? The idea that you must always be apparent, you must always be present. So for him, he puts it this way. He says, could it be that all systems, all individuals harbor a secret urge to be rid of their ideas or their own essences so as to be able to proliferate everywhere? And this kind of analysis he brings it up at other points later on when he speaks about diseases, specifically cancer and AIDS, and how these two diseases are extensions of our kind of cultural logic of proliferation, or of a kind of proliferation or emancipation, where he says that cancer, how it is the proliferation, at least how he understands it, the proliferation of cells shares an affinity with this system of proliferation. So what he says is that when a living form becomes disordered, when, as in cancer, a genetically determined set of rules ceases to function, the cells begin to proliferate chaotically, just as some biological disorders indicate a break in the genetic code, so the present disorder in art may be interpreted as a fundamental break in the secret code of aesthetics. And art is something that's kind of... He's certainly not an art historian, and he has that book, The Conspiracy of Art, which doesn't really talk about art all that much. He just praises Andy Warhol. But this certainly demands some clarification. So Baudrillard generally looks down on modern art, saying like it's not, it's a product of our kind of shitty times that we live in, except for Andy Warhol, who he says was effective at becoming a machine. So Baudrillard applauds Warhol by not trying to be a kind of a real thing in a world that has lost reality. Baudrillard believes that Andy Warhol was someone that was able to see what kind of world he was in and then able to emulate that. So art, as he says about it today, I'll just read what he says. Whereas art was once essentially a utopia, that is to say, ultimately unrealizable, today this utopia has been realized. Thanks to the media, computer science, and video technology, everyone is now a potential creator, which is certainly true. Like, you go to any kind of urban, so shouldn't even say that, everywhere there are so many people desiring to be made, Instagram famous or something like that via their artwork or via their photography is a big one. Everyone's a photographer. Everyone's a professional photographer now. And Baudrillard was a photographer, actually. So he he participated in this just as much as anyone else. And it would be very wrong to think that Baudrillard somehow stood outside of all of this. But yeah, and he goes on to say about that secretly we are all iconoclasts. Not in the sense that we destroy images, but in the sense that we manufacture a profusion of images in which there is nothing to see. So it is not as though the content itself is devoid of meaning, right? Any single given image can be one that is riddled with meaning. But when there's a profusion of images, it kind of follows the supply and demand, logic. If you flood the market with images, they lose their meaning in that way. If there are images everywhere, there are images nowhere. But even with this analysis, like I said before, there are always kinds of returns to illusion or to mystery, where Baudrillard says, following his kind of tirade against modern art, he says that our images are like icons. They allow us to go on believing in art while eluding the question of its existence. So, perhaps, we ought to treat all present-day art as a set of rituals, and for ritual use only. Perhaps we ought to consider art solely from an anthropological standpoint without reference to any aesthetic judgment whatsoever. The implication is that we have returned to the cultural stage of primitive societies. So in that way, it's not as though we've totally gone beyond anything that has an attachment to what I will kind of naively consider reality, that is primitive, quote-unquote, societies, because Baudrillard is signaling, a kind of formative return to that stage, right? At the level of appearance, we have in part returned to that stage, which again makes it difficult to know, where does Baudrillard exactly stand in all of this? Because almost immediately following this point, Baudrillard asks the intriguing question, is the human in modern day society simply another form of the human, or have they completely altered and become a machine? Or, as he says, in the present day, the question goes as follows: am I a man or just a potential clone? Which is certainly the case if we consider art, at least how he understands it, where everyone considers themselves a creator. Baudrillard would then kind of syllogistically suggest that, because everyone considers themselves to be in this same position, to take on this kind of same essence or to take on the same form, they are in that sense clones of one another. So to curb this, there are a few strategies that we employ in order to convince ourselves of our humanity, right? So then we surround ourselves with things like pornography that convince us of there being like an innate biological human function, where we surround ourselves with various, internet quasi intellectuals saying that things like biology are natural, or that sex and gender are natural, or any kind of jargon like that, which serves the end of kind of inoculating us from realizing the extent to which we have been immersed in simulation, or immersed in hyperreality, or immersed in the simulacrum, in favor of rendering us kind of docile to, or rendering us subordinate to, a kind of biological imperative, or to anything like that we can cathartically kind of give ourselves over to. Where these kinds of discourses serve as vessels for us to displace our anxieties about the world, and to then allow us to fall back on various axiomatic presuppositions about the human, about nature, about reality, that are unchanging, that are taken as a priori, as things that are universal, which gives us a certain degree of comfort. But I believe, and I think that Baudrillard is really correct, and you got to kind of read between the lines, I think, to get to this. All right, so it's just me, I guess. But I think Baudrillard is really on point when he lays out the various ways in which people try to convince themselves of their own humanity, right? So that they are not simply a clone, or as he says it, not simply a satellite, right? Where humans have kind of satellitized themselves into outer space, not being part of a world anymore. And this is just one of the things that can be observed with various television programs like Black Mirror, for instance, where I would say, doing like a Baudrillardian reading of Black Mirror, this show serves this kind of strategic purpose of convincing us that the loss of humanity is kind of always on the horizon, where it's as though this kind of loss of humanity didn't occur, 300 years ago with the Enlightenment and the kind of destruction of illusion. No, it's with us owning little, technical gadgets that's going to take us away from humanity. It's like, and people like these kinds of things because it gives us a very easy way to understand this loss of humanity, or this kind of a loss of reality, or anything like that, which is, really, it's kind of naive, and it's just not all that critical. But of course, with that being said, Baudrillard still has a lot to say about virtual technologies or anything like that, where he says, thanks to the machinery of the virtual, all your problems are over. You are no longer either subject nor object, no longer either free nor alienated, and no longer either one of the other, neither one nor the other. You are the same, and enraptured by the commutations of that sameness. So here we hear the echoes of his ecstasy of communication, right? So we like to get lost in communication, how it kind of puts us in a kind of state of kind of tranquility. There's a better word, but it's evading me. Where communication becomes something for the sake of itself. We communicate not to, not as a mode of betterment for society or community or anything like that. We communicate for the sake of communicating, right? So it's about making oneself available to the world. So we are no longer alienated, right? When he says that, and there's another place where he says it quite eloquently. We are no longer alienated because we are given over to the complete spectacle of society, where the problem is not in the Marxist sense anymore, alienating one from oneself, or one from one's labor, or one from the fruits of one's labor, but actually alienating is something of the past. We are now wholly present to all things. We are now wholly unalienated. We are wholly connected to the things we surround ourselves with, right? With our phone, our, computer, or whatever, because they operate to some extent to connect us to that world, to keep us in a state of perpetual communication, which has supplanted the need to have a kind of, and I use this term I hesitate to use this term, to have a kind of real connection to our products or to anything like that. But then he has a kind of interesting little passage here about artificial intelligence, where he says that artificial intelligence is devoid of intelligence because it is devoid of artifice. In this sense, they may be said to be virtuous as well as virtual. They can never succumb to their own object. They are immune even to the seduction of their own knowledge. Their virtue resides in their transparency, their functionality, their absence of passion and artifice. Artificial intelligence is a celibate machine. So when he says that it is devoid of artifice, it's a very difficult idea. I think in a sense because for him ultimately artificiality is what is the primary condition of existence. That is the only place where intelligence, being a wholly human thing, can exist. Where intelligence, it can only be occupied by the human that is conflictual. The non-contradictory human, because it is devoid of artifice, cannot have intelligence. So therefore, the non-contradictory artificial intelligence, one that is perfectly coded, perfectly mapped, perfectly understood, cannot then take on intelligence, because intelligence demands a kind of spontaneity, demands creativity, it demands, a certain degree of doubt. I don't know of any artificial intelligence that can instill doubt yet, but maybe one day, which is interesting, because the artificial intelligence, at least in cinema, in the dystopian imaginations of it, is something that reaches a certain degree of perfection. And it is through its perfection, through its ability to eradicate completely, that it attains its kind of power, that it opposes the human. But I don't, it seems as though if the intelligent, quote-unquote, intelligent machines were to attain a certain degree of intelligence capable of doing any such thing, they would actually need to take on a certain degree of conflictuality, as we understand it through Baudrillard here. They would actually need to take on a kind of abstractness, a kind of humanity, right? Or a kind of artificiality of their own intelligence. And perhaps I'm going down a kind of, I'm thinking out loud here. I shouldn't do that. I'll stick to the script. Maybe someone got something out of that little rambling, but I'll jump back into this here. So to give us a better idea of how Baudrillard considers the kind of strategies we employ, be they scientific or discursive or anything like that, to convince us of a kind of a real human essence, he says that he speaks about that as follows: by breaking the body down into organs and functions, biophysio and anatomical science had already begun a process of analytical dissection of which micromolecular genetics is merely a logical extension, though at a much higher level of abstraction and simulation, at the nuclear level of the command cell, directly at the level of the genetic code. And it is around genetics that this whole phantasmagoria is organized. The functional and mechanist view still treated each bodily organ as a partial and differentiated prosthesis. Simulation was already part of the picture, but simulation of a traditional kind, right? So this emphasizes the idea that there's not just kind of one form of simulation and it is oppressive. Simulation takes on all these kinds of different forms. It either works in the betterment of humans or the kind of destruction of humanity. And then he gives us a kind of interesting look into how this motivates racism, where he says that much the same for racism, which has also become an imminent, viral, and everyday reality. The fact is that the scientific and rational critique of racism is purely a formal one, which demolishes the arguments from biology but remains caught in the racist trap because it addresses a biological illusion only and fails to deal with it fails to deal with biology itself qua illusion. So to all those kinds of, nutbags out there, the Stefan Molyneux of the world who think that racism comes down to level of biology, very extremely problematically. Perhaps I shouldn't say nutbag. I won't edit that out, but I retract that, saying that these people who say that biology is something that is or racism is something that is natural or anything like that. And to those people that come back and say, coming at these arguments with kind of truth claims, like saying that biology actually says other things, Baudrillard says, okay, that's fine, right? You've kind of demolished that racism, which is, of course, a good thing, but we still maintain in that theorization the illusion that biology somehow transcends simulation or transcends anything else, or it's a kind of transcendent realm that taps us into a kind of reality, which for Baudrillard is a big no-no because, and this is how I understand it, biology can never encapsulate the totality of humankind. Rather, and we can understand this certainly better through Foucault, biology is something that is has embedded within it operations of exclusion that omit certain bodies from entering it and kind of homogenize this idea of a human body, that naturalize it to some extent. And by naturalizing it, it kind of galvanizes it and crystallizes it, freezes it in time and space, which is an example of an oppressive form of simulation as Baudrillard describes it. What is threatened in this moment is the possible realization of another, which is totally necessary for Baudrillard because he works very much in the domain of dualities, where there's one interview with him, I can't remember which, I think it's with François Libanet, I think, but I could be wrong about that, or it could be Philippe Pizzi, one of those people, where one of the interviewers asked him, why is it that you maintain things like binaries? Because we know that these are kind of oppressive frameworks. To which Baudrillard says that he doesn't think that either one of the constitutive components of a binary should be fixed in time and space. What he sees as necessary is that there are distinctions in the world. He thinks that it is necessary that there are always a kind of antagonism at play, where this antagonism is necessary to wrest each respective position of the binary from their own essence to drive it into something new. So the examples he gives are things like hot and cold, where you can't understand what hot is unless you understand what cold is. And by extension, once we have established these distinctions and how one is fundamentally predicated upon the other, so we're dealing with deconstruction in this way to some extent, which Baudrillard doesn't really ever take up. In fact, he criticizes it. What we see in that is the possibility, at least for Baudrillard, that the definition of hotness will always be negotiated. The same goes for coldness, because they are not predicated on their fundamental essences or their kind of unchanging characteristics, but are always determined by the other. So he thinks that these dualities are necessary, or these binaries are necessary to allow for these kinds of developments across time. With that being said, of course, there are problems associated with binaries, undoubtedly, and it's a shame that for him he only thinks about them in relation to binaries, and why they can't take on other forms it seems a little bit reductive to me, but I do, to defend his claims here, I think that he makes a very good point about the way that binaries work to seduce things from their respective positions and to continually propel them into new spaces. So this outlines the importance of the other, right? So of this, he says that man and machine has become isomorphic and indifferent to each other. Neither is other to the other. The computer has no other. That is why the computer is not intelligent. Intelligence comes to us from the other always, because intelligence is that thing that can only be measured not as a thing in itself, but by being in relation to something else. So the computer, in its perfect operability, in its perfect functioning or whatever, it cannot be considered intelligence, because that is only understood as a kind of perfection in itself. It's a kind of globalized understanding, or what will soon be totally globalized understanding of what constitutes intelligence. You know, the kind of Jeopardy syndrome, where we mistake someone's ability to iterate facts. Don't get me wrong, I love Jeopardy. Iterate facts, or to kind of regurgitate facts, as being intelligence, where these people there are, of course, many of them are probably very intelligent, but it doesn't actually signify their intelligence by being able to regurgitate facts. It propels them into the domain of kind of computer-likeness, where, following Baudrillard's understanding of it, because it has no other, because there's no negotiation there, it is not at all intelligent. So this is why for him, the thing like the double, or the unheimlich kind of, holds such an important place in, Western culture, Western, literary tradition or philosophical tradition, anything like that, where he says that of all the prostheses that punctuate the history of the body, the double is doubtless the most ancient. The double, however, is not properly speaking a prosthesis at all. Rather, it is an imaginary figure, like the soul, the shadow, or the mirror image, which haunts the subject as his other, causing him to be himself while at the same time never seeming like himself. So it is that double that is necessary to call attention or to disturb the reality of the original, right? To disturb the idea that the original is wholly unique, that the original is wholly themselves, and to instead take them from that position of subjectivity into a certain degree of objectivity, where they become other to themselves. So this is really apparent in his whole discussion of seduction in relation to Suite Vénitienne. Who wrote that? Sophie Calle. So Sophie Calle wrote a piece about how she followed someone for like a month or something, and Baudrillard literally followed them through the streets and lost them and had to go find them again. It could be longer than that, and I could have the temporality a little off for the length of time. Baudrillard takes that idea up to suggest that following someone is actually a very nice illustration of seduction, because both people are undergoing a kind of a loss of subjectivity, where the person being followed, believing themselves to be working their own trajectory that is wholly their own, has that disturbed by having someone follow them, because it takes them out of that subjectivity, implying that it can be perfectly copied, can be perfectly replicated, taking it away from its originality, right? It's kind of reproducibility, destroying its aura. And then the person following, it's pretty, I think, self-explanatory. They are not determining where they are going by themselves. They are being determined by another. So in that moment, the one discussed by Sophie Calle that Baudrillard takes up, subjectivity is kind of overthrown in favor of an objectivity in the seductive moment. So the double serves this function by resting the original subject outside of themselves, implying that they can be fully copied, that they can be fully replicated, taking them outside of the appreciation of them, or removing them from their own appreciation of themselves towards a kind of unknown sphere of objectivity, where they become susceptible to the whims of whatever is taking command of them. And this all really comes down to the transparency of evil. So he's rethinking the banality of evil as it was conceived of by Hannah Arendt, where evil is simply that thing that is common, right? Evil is not something, is not a spectacular kind of extraordinary thing. It actually exists in day-to-day. People are very susceptible to evil. And Baudrillard, I think, in a sense, takes it up by saying that evil is something that can be observed in transparency, where transparency, having things become totally apparent, hyper-present, or hyper-real, is a mode of evil. And it should be challenged. It shouldn't be immediately accepted as, a natural thing to be seen or want to be seen or anything like that, but marks a kind of evil moment, something that's not very good. So that reminds me of another passage somewhere, and I can't remember where. He has like 40 books, so please excuse me for not remembering exactly where he says everything. But he says that the good or goodness is when there is the maintenance of good and evil, when good and evil still exist, where evil has not been totally eradicated. Evil, on the other hand, is when there is just good, when there has been an effective homogenization of all things good, eradicating evilness, kind of putting us into a kind of new world order, kind of globalized system that is wholly oppressive. And I don't know if there's much more than that. This is a pretty short book. I think I was able to get quite a bit out of it here. But yeah, for those that actually tuned into this, I hope that it was good. I hope that if anyone was listening to this to avoid having to read the book, I would say certainly go and read it. My arguments are obviously prejudiced, and I am by no means the authority on these things. Baudrillard is the authority on these things. Go read the book. If you can read it in French, read it in French. But, if you can't do that, I hope that this was somewhat helpful. And for those that disagree with me or have any comments or anything, I'd love to hear them. But for now,